I think it is clear to believe in the power of ideas.
Fresh thinking of the Manhattan Institute.
Good afternoon. I'm Larry Mone, president of the Manhattan Institute. It's my honor to offer a brief introduction for Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker today. As you all know, Scott Walker was elected the governor of Wisconsin in November of 2010. And last month, he scored another victory by an even wider margin that extends far beyond Wisconsin. The story of what has happened in Wisconsin over the past 2 years is an example of what can happen when good ideas are combined with courageous political leadership. When Governor Walker took office, Wisconsin faced an enormous budget deficit. Rather than turn to tax increases and budget gimmicks, the governor decided to address the fundamental issue behind the state's fiscal imbalance: out of control public sector wage and benefit costs. The governor asked public sector workers to bring their terms of employment more in line with those of private sector employees. He worked to restrict collective bargaining and require public workers to make more modest contributions toward their retirement and health plans. The national media screamed bloody murder, but Governor Walker stuck to his guns. And when the dust settled, Wisconsinites realized that Governor Walker's reforms were not a right-wing plot to destroy government. In fact, just the opposite. Thanks to Governor Walker's reforms, there's actually more money available for vital public services: police, schools, hospitals, not less. Thanks to Governor Walker's courageous leadership today, Wisconsin economy is growing and its fiscal outlook is among the strongest in the nation. The Manhattan Institute is pleased to have played a small role in the exciting changes that have occurred in Wisconsin over the past 2 years. And through our Center for State and Local Leadership and its Public Sector Inc. initiative, we plan to encourage other state and local leaders, and those at the federal level as well, to follow Governor Walker's example. It really shouldn't be that hard to convince them, because as Governor Walker has shown the entire nation, good policy is also good politics. Please join me in welcoming Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker.
Thanks. Thanks. Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be back. I said last time I was in speaking, I was here with another good friend of mine, Governor Mitch Daniels, who's done it. What's that? Yes. Yes. Yeah. I thought you were going to qualify him as president. I said somebody wanted me president, just not at Purdue, but that's a whole other matter. But Mitch, for many of us, was a great mentor in terms of a number of things he has done for the great state of Indiana and done to help the people and the taxpayers of that state. I want to talk a little bit about not just what we've done in Wisconsin, but I think the impact it can have on other states around the country and on, as was mentioned, on the nation's government. And then I'd like to spend a fair amount of time taking some questions, because I think that's probably the most interesting, just as we had a little dialogue with some of the staff, some of the fellows before as well. It's interesting. You mentioned in the introduction, and sometimes I get people who will tell me, thanks for the courage. I grew up in a small town down the road from where Paul Ryan grew up in Janesville. I was in Delavan, small town in south central Wisconsin, and Paul grew up and still lives in Janesville. And Paul's obviously done a lot of courageous things in particularly the last year, but for the last many years. And we kind of chuckle sometimes when we talk about it, because he said politics has got to be the only profession where you get called courageous just by keeping your word. I mean, everywhere else outside of politics, in life and business, it's expected, right? But somehow you're extraordinary just by keeping your word. But that's essentially all we did. We kept the promises we made to the taxpayers to be good stewards of the taxpayers' dollars, to do what we said we would do during the campaign. And I remember shortly after I was elected, we started talking about some of the things even in the transition. And the media in my capital was like astonished. It was like they couldn't believe that someone would actually campaign on something and not only would want to get it done, but might want to get it done fairly quickly. In our case, it was simple. We did it because it was an economic and a fiscal crisis that we faced in our state. When I campaigned, I talked about that for about the 18 months leading up to November 2010. And then, like any of you who take over a business, if you're in the private sector, if you take over a business that's failing, but you see some benefit in taking it over, when you take it over, you don't fail to act on it for a year or 6 months. You act on it right away, right? You take action right away. Because if you saw the value of taking it over, you said, well, there's something good there. We just need better management, better organization, better something. That's what we did in Wisconsin. And the very first day, we called the legislature into session, a special session focused on jobs. We immediately started to tackle our fiscal issues. And those are some of the things I want to talk about today. But it also starts with, I think, a certain degree of a mindset that I hope many, if not all, of the strong candidates I'm behind and others are like them across the country should be thinking about, not just when they get in office, but even thinking about when they're running. I remember I think it was last first week or second week of December. So last year, end of the year, a good friend of mine down in Alexandria, I was over for dinner and on a trip in and out of D.C. And this friend, very much a supporter of mine, was not doubting our efforts, was not doubting what was going on with the recall campaign, but was very inquisitive. So at dinner, Tonette and I are there, and he said, Scott, did you ever wonder if you hadn't gone so far, if you might not be facing a recall election? And you know, a couple of other people at dinner with us were a little raised eyebrows, like, you know, he implying. I said, no, it's just an inquisitive guy, was not second guessing, but asked, I thought, a very legitimate question. He said, have you ever wondered if you hadn't gone quite so far, if you wouldn't be facing a recall? After I thought about it for a moment, I said, well, you know, if I hadn't gone as far as we did, we wouldn't have fixed it. So I said, now I plan on winning. Thankfully now, 7 months later, I can say I did win, or 8 months later, I can say I didn't win. But at the time, I told him, I said, I plan on winning. I'm going to run to win. I'm going to tell the story that I think can help us to win. I said, but I'm not afraid to lose. Because in the end, if you do something for the right reason, if you're doing it not just because you want to be somebody great, because you want to do something great, you don't need to worry about the winning and losing. That will come along. And thankfully, as you mentioned in the introduction we talked about before as well, hopefully what we've taught, not just other governors, other mayors, other elected officials at the federal level, that good policy can be good politics. But you have to have absolute clarity and consistency, and you have to make that message over and over and over again to the voters. I think if you do, not only in Wisconsin, but I think in particular in other swing states across the country, it can have an impact. Let me tell you a little bit about what we did, and then, like I said, open up some questions. In our case, the economic and the fiscal crisis, while it was not the same in size, it's very similar in proportion to what we face in our nation's government as well, in the federal government. We came in, we had a $3.6 billion budget deficit. We're a mid-sized state. We're about just over 5.5 million people. But our budget deficit at $3.6 billion was one of the biggest in the state's history per capita. It was one of the biggest in the country. And we looked at it and we said, you know, we're not going to do it the way that other states have done it in the past. And you're going to hear me pick a little bit on Illinois. It's kind of like shooting fish in a barrel. But it's an interesting contrast because in Illinois' case, you know, they did just about all the poor choices that other states did pieces of along the way. You know, some states last year, because most states like Wisconsin, there's only a handful that didn't have budget deficits. Most states had budget deficits, but most of them chose to balance them in ways other than what we did in Wisconsin. Again, in Illinois' case, they used just about every one of these examples. Some saw fit to raise taxes. We didn't raise taxes. In fact, we lowered the overall tax burden in our state. Proud to say that property taxes went down for the first time in 12 years on a median valued home in our state, because we knew that would have an impact on our not just our residents as property taxpayers, but particularly our small businesses. Our overall tax burden went down. We have 100% exemption, for example, in capital gains for investments made in Wisconsin-based companies. We have investment incentives out there for manufacturing and agricultural-based interests, which are key parts of our state's economy. We do all sorts of things, and my next goal is to do even more to lower, and not just targeted, but across the board, income tax levels in the state of Wisconsin, because I think that will continue to make us competitive and putting more people to work and putting more money back in the hands of the consumers and the entrepreneurs in our state. But we lowered the overall tax burden. In contrast, Illinois, other states as well, but Illinois raised their income tax 67% on individuals, 46% on businesses. Remember at the time, the folks down in Springfield probably said, we're not going to do what Wisconsin's doing. Clearly they did not. You know, a year later, their budget problems are even bigger. You know, we were able to balance our budget, not just balance it, but we've had a budget surplus. In fact, for the last 2 years, it's the first time ever we've had 2 consecutive years where we set money aside for the rainy day fund. Our budget has been so solid. Moody's called our budget credit positive, maintained our positive bond rating. At the same time, earlier this year, Moody's downgraded Illinois to the lowest, although Jerry Brown's going to give a little run for the money in California the way things are going. You know, you look at their pension system in Illinois, it's 43% funded. Ours, according to the Pew Center, is the only 100% funded pension system in the country. Part of that is not just because of our reforms. Part of that is because even people before me had the foresight to put in place, even though it's a pension system, one that's very much like a 401k in terms of the defined contribution type system where it's a pension, but where we have a core base program, and then on top of that, investments that are made that prior to 2008, our retirees gained. They were beneficiaries of the positive aspects of the investments since 2008, like everybody, not just around the country, but in many cases around the world. They shared in the sacrifice, but that allowed us to have a completely 100% funded pension system, unlike states like Illinois and others that are under 50% right now. That's a tremendous negative for them as well. So no tax increases. We avoided massive layoffs, which is something you wouldn't pick up from the national media because you'd think I must have laid off every public employee in the state of Wisconsin. We have over 300 public servants at both the state and the local level in Wisconsin. We avoided massive layoffs. Not because I don't want limited government, I do. But I think you get there through managed reform. You don't get there through random pink slips. And so we avoided massive layoffs. Instead, we took advantage of some of the retirements, so attrition. We're making changes that allow us at both the state and the local level through our changes in collective bargaining to manage that. But we're doing it in a way that makes sense. It's not just arbitrary. My predecessor did massive waves of furloughs, and others have done massive layoffs. In Illinois, the governor's proposed closing 14 state facilities. Think of all the layoffs of the employees, including a state mental health complex and the state prison. I mean, those are some real significant choices to be made, not because of managed reform, but because of the budget crisis that they're facing and the poor choices they're being given. And we didn't even make cuts in terms of things like Medicaid. In fact, surprised most people, but I put $1.2 billion into Medicaid. Now, I reformed it along the way. If you listen to my adversaries, you'd think I cut $500 million. That's because without any changes, Medicaid will require an advance of $1.8 billion in this budget. We put $1.2 billion, more money than any governor did in Wisconsin history. But we said along the way we were going to make changes to make it sustainable. Simple things, I think, logical, common sense things. Things like saying if you have health insurance from your employer, you should take it from him or her. You shouldn't take it from the government, from the taxpayers. If you're someone in your 20s connected to your parents and they have health insurance, you should get it from them. You shouldn't get it from the taxpayers. And if you're employed, or if you're not employed, or you're in a situation, I should say, where your employer doesn't have health insurance, if you're eligible for one of our Medicaid-funded programs, but your employment income is increasing as you progress, you should progress in terms of what your premiums and your copays are. So eventually, you're able to slide into the private sector and no longer be dependent on the government. Pretty simple ideas. In fact, even the thresholds we used, as much as our opponents tried to knock us on it, were actually thresholds that came out of the Affordable Care Act, so-called Affordable Care Act, in terms of being reasonable standards of expectation. So we even used those same numbers. But that allowed us to save about $500 million, and more importantly, it's compounded savings because we make those changes that only get better over time as more people are involved in that reform process. So we avoided massive tax increases. We avoided massive layoffs. We avoided cuts in core programs like Medicaid. Part of the reason why I didn't cut Medicaid, Illinois, interestingly enough, was cutting more than $1 billion of Medicaid. On top of that, they had to raise cigarette tax to make up the difference. I think their hole was about $2.7 billion because they failed to make some of the reforms that we did. In each of those areas, with Medicaid in particular, we knew that when we needed a reform, if you just cut back, for example, as my predecessor did with reducing reimbursement rates, all you're doing is pushing that off to healthcare providers and hospitals, which in turn becomes a hidden tax on employers because they just push it off to the people who can pay for it, or portions of it. And so we didn't want that hidden tax out there as well. So we avoided those things. Instead, we put in place long-term structural reforms that helped us to balance not just our state budget, but our local government budgets, and not just for now, but for generations to come. As I said all throughout the last year and a half, what we did fundamentally was about thinking more about the next generation than we did about the next election. Isn't that what you elect people to do? It'd be nice if a lot more people in Washington did that. You know, think more about the next generation than just about the next election. I get asked all the time. They're here with me, not in this room today, but they were outside earlier. People ask me, you know, why did you do the things you did? I said, it's simple. I've got two reasons. One's named Matt, the other's named Alex. Matt just turned 18. Alex will turn 17 at the end of this month. For me, it was real simple. I wanted them to live in a state and ultimately a country, to inherit a state and a country that was better than the one I grew up in. And I knew the way things were headed in our state government, and I think it's very parallel in our federal government as well, that unless someone stepped in and made some dramatic changes, that wouldn't be possible for them. I think if people think of it in terms of those contexts, whether it's your kids or your grandkids, it's a whole lot easier to make some tough decisions out there. Because if you think it in terms of what's better for the next generation, not just the next election, it adds a whole lot more clarity in what needs to be done. That's what we did in Wisconsin. The reason I think it has an impact and why I think it should be noteworthy is not just because of election, not because of name ID or anything else like that. I think it's simple in combination because of what we did, but also because nobody can argue the voters of our state didn't know what was going on. I mean, right? I mean, think about it. In some ways, I didn't feel it at the time, but in some ways, maybe I should thank some of the protesters that were there because they brought such clarity to this issue. Now, we tried to respond in a way that kept the focus on the issues, not on the attacks. I remember late last year, I think it was November. Yeah, it was about November because it was a Sunday afternoon between going to church and the Packers game, two religious experiences in the state of Wisconsin. So the Packers were playing at 3:15 our time, which means I had a little bit of time to take my boys out, one of their friends, and rake leaves. So I'm out. We have a governor's residence, but my kids still go to a public school in Wauwatosa outside of Milwaukee. And so many days we're in Wauwatosa instead of the governor's residence. So that particular day, we'd come home from church, went back to our home in Wauwatosa. We're out raking the leaves. I live on a busy street, 68th Street, pretty busy street. It's just on the edge of Milwaukee, a few blocks from Milwaukee. And I'm out raking leaves, and this car comes by, and I hear a honk, and I turn around. The guy's got his window down, arm out the window. He flips me off. And the guy that's one of the friends of my son Matthew says, Mr. Walker, how do you put up with that? I said, well, you know, it's one thing in the Capitol. It's another thing when you're out officially around the state. I said, it's a little rough. It's a little raw in front of your house. I mean, there's two little girls that live next door to us. There's an 80-year-old woman who lives the house over. I said, it's kind of raw out there. I said, but you try and stay positive. You don't let it get to you, and sooner or later something good will come along. And Kevin kind of shrugs a little bit. We go back to raking. Literally not more than a minute or two goes by. I hear honking again. I'm thinking, Lord, maybe I should have raked at night. You know, I mean, maybe this would have been better off. And so being a masochist, I turned around and I looked, and now there's not one, but there's two cars. One right after another. Both of them are rolling down the window. Both of them, the arms come out. I think, here it goes. Both of them go like this. Of course, Gavin turns to me and he goes, Mr. Walker, did you know that was going to happen? I said, no, but it proved my point, which is something I learned from my parents. You know, be true to your principles, but also be decent. You know, be decent about how you conduct yourself. I said that's probably the best lesson my kids hopefully learned out of all this was, you know, how to be true to your principles, but be decent about it and don't treat others the way they're treating you, or at least some were treating us. But I think why I tell you that story is while there were episodes like that, I think by us staying focused on getting things done, on fixing things, not on having battles, not on beating up one side or the other. Another lesson I used to teach to new members of the legislature when I was mentoring members when I was in the state assembly was don't ever personalize your differences because your opponent today may be your ally tomorrow. And I found it all the time. Even with Democrats, I'd find somebody I'd fight with like cats and dogs. A week or two later, we'd be on school choice or some other issue like that down the way. We'd find a way to work together on it. And so we tried to stay focused on that. Why I think that's important and what that means beyond just Wisconsin's borders is because we stayed focused on that, because the issues were so clear, because of all the attention, not just within our state but nationally, no one can argue that the voters didn't know what was going on. In fact, I remember the last month or two of the election, I used to go around on the stump and I'd say, does anybody remember what this recall election was about? Because my opponents never talked about it. In fact, one of them, the state Democrat spokesperson, literally told a publication a few months before the election that they weren't going to talk about collective bargaining anymore because it was a loser. It was a losing issue. So instead, we went around and we said, you know what? It was about our reforms, and we're proud to talk about it. Our reforms, we've documented more than $1 billion worth of savings that our reforms have provided for the taxpayers of the state of Wisconsin. We pointed out, as I mentioned before, that property taxes went down for the first time in 12 years on a median valued home. We pointed out that we took a budget deficit, one of the biggest we'd ever had, and made it to a budget surplus. And we pointed out that since we took office, more than 41,000 new jobs have been created in the private sector, and our unemployment rate, which had peaked out at over 9% just a few years before I took office, was now below 7% for the first time since 2008. All those things happened because of our reforms. And I was asked recently at an event Paul and I had a day or two, actually it was the day before, the 4th of July, on July 3rd, when Paul and I reminded the press in our state of then candidate Barack Obama's statements about the level of debt and the deficit at that time being unpatriotic, and how that was 4 years ago and $5 trillion since that we've added to the nation's debt. But we pointed out to the press that what all had happened with that, and we said it's real simple. The voters understood what was going on. The voters in our state understood what was going on. They saw the results. They saw the impact. They saw what we were able to do. And they didn't just elect us. They elect us by a larger margin with a larger turnout. What I hope this says more than anything, not just in my state but around the country, is if you stay true to your word, if voters mean it, and I don't know about you, but folks, anybody who's talked to voters along the way, John, I see John Stossel back there, you've talked to a lot of voters out in the street, a lot of people out in the street out along the way. I'm sure one of the complaints you've heard over the years, I've heard it from others out there, is the idea that people complain to me more than anything. They complain about two things. One, about politicians who make promises and fail to deliver. I hear that all the time. But the other complaint I hear is that I'll hear from voters, doesn't matter, not just Republicans or conservatives, I'll hear it from the full spectrum. Voters who will complain saying, you know what? Why is it that politicians, when they get into office, fail to take on the tough issues? All of us can see plain as day what needs to be done. We all get it. We all understand what's at stake at our local, at our state, the federal level, but why is it that politicians can't take on these tough issues and get things done? Well, I hope the lesson we've taught is you can. You can, and voters will see it. We proved not only in the economic and the fiscal, but I want to tell you one other quick area, and then, like I said, in a second, I'll take some questions. We proved it in terms of just how government operates. See, one of the great things we did that gets, I think, the least amount of coverage, we made the government work better for the people we elected to serve. No better example of that than in public education. You see, for years, I'm a homeowner in Wauwatosa. Tonette and I have a home, and at the same time, we had two boys who were in the public high school. And historically, we're told we've got to be pitted against each other. Either you raise property taxes or your schools suffer, right? You hear that all the time. That's a false choice. That's a false choice. It's not about more money in education. It's about spending the money more wisely. That's what it's fundamentally all about. I'll give you a couple great examples of that. Some of you heard about this before, but in our state, before my reforms, under collective bargaining, almost every one of my school districts had to buy their health insurance from just one company. That company just happened to be affiliated with the teachers union. Well, now that our reforms are in effect, other than a handful of districts that ran out and did contracts before our law went into effect, for everybody else, they can bid their health insurance out. And that's literally saved our school districts across the state of Wisconsin tens of millions of dollars. I grew up in a small town, a small school district, very limited number of students. For Delavan-Darien School District alone, they saved $970,000 over the next 2 years just in their health insurance. Milwaukee is one of those districts that still has a contract, but there are some projecting as much as $40 million or more alone in that district will be saved just by bidding out their health insurance. That's a tremendous savings that couldn't have happened before because of collective bargaining. The other one's more important than just money, though. It is one of the other untold stories is by changing and reforming collective bargaining in our state, it didn't just help us save dollars. It's going to help us save our schools and our local and our state government as well. Because, see, now we don't have to hire based on seniority and tenure. We can hire based on merit. We can pay based on performance. That means in the end we can put the best and the brightest in our classroom, and we can keep them there. We can keep them there. That means good things for our schools and our counties and our towns and our villages, and ultimately for our state government. All those things happen because of our reforms. Now, my belief is if we can take on something as big as that in Wisconsin, a swing state, a state where AFSCME was founded, the founding of the so-called progressive movement, there's no doubt it can be taken on anywhere else across the country, whether it's in Albany, whether it's in Columbus, whether it's in Springfield or St. Paul, or whether it's anywhere else around the country, and certainly in the halls of Congress, where Lord knows we could use a little bit more courage to take on these tough issues. There's a handful out there, people like Paul Ryan and others that are trying to do equally, if not more courageous things. But people need to be reassured that voters mean it. They mean it when they say, we want elected officials, we want our leaders to have the courage to take on tough issues. That's exactly what's at stake. Now, the reason for my optimism that not only in the fall in the elections, but more importantly in January, when some of our new leaders in Washington and states across the country take office, will take that on. It's because I think that's a part of who we are as Americans. Later today, I'm going to get on a train in Penn Station and go down to Philadelphia. And I'm giving a speech making a stop tomorrow. But one of the other reasons why I brought Matt and Alex along was not just to see the Statue of Liberty and the 9/11 memorial here, but it's for them to join me in Independence Hall. Now, I only went there for the first time in my life last year. Hard to believe. I mentioned my dad was as a minister. I grew up in a small town, so we didn't know it then, but we were poor. And we always, the joke was, we had a white Impala station wagon. Our vacations were usually about as far as we could drive in that station wagon and then turn around and come back. So we didn't have to stay in a hotel more than one day because we didn't have enough money to stay more than one night out on a vacation usually. And so we never got to Washington or Philadelphia or places like that. But last September, I had a chance to come for a Governors Association meeting in Philadelphia. And I remember getting up early in the morning, not just to see the Liberty Bell, but particularly to go to Independence Hall. And how remarkable that was to me, because as a kid growing up, I loved history, still love it. But as a kid in particular, I used to think of our founders almost like superheroes. Some of the other kids, I think, probably give me a little grief for that. But, I mean, to me, our founders are bigger than life. And I remember that day in mid-September when we were in Independence Hall, and I hope my kids experience a little bit of the same tomorrow when we're over there. But I remember standing in Independence Hall, which for those of you, probably most, if not all of you, have been there, the hall where our founders sat, it's not much bigger than this room right here. You see the desk, you see the chairs. Heck, I love the chair up the top in the front, half-rising sun where George Washington sat, and thinking about all the other amazing founders in the room. As I stood there, just blown away in one hand, but also profoundly taken by the fact that those chairs that are still there aren't much different than the ones we're sitting in here today. And it just reminded me, should remind all of us, that our founders were ordinary people. Ordinary people who did something quite extraordinary. They didn't just risk their political careers. They didn't just risk their business ventures. They literally risked their lives for the freedoms we hold dear today. Wasn't it Franklin that said, we don't hang together, surely we'll hang separately. The reason I tell you that, it was moments like that and others like that over the last year and a half that reminded me in our battle in Wisconsin, but should remind all of us all across this country, what has made America great, what has made America exceptional, what had arguably made this country the greatest country in the history of the world, I believe that in moments of crisis, be it economic or fiscal, be it spiritual or military, in those moments of crisis, what has made our country so amazing has been the fact that there have been men and women of courage, and there have been people willing to support them, men and women of courage who have been willing to stand up and think more about the future of their children and their grandchildren than they thought about their own political futures. For us in Wisconsin, that was one of those moments. And I think looking ahead to November, it's one of those moments here in America as well. And I'm an optimist. I still believe there's enough of us in America who care more about our children and our grandchildren's future than we care about our own. Enough people who are willing to stand up and not just be leaders, but support those leaders who choose to make those tough decisions, to take on those tough tasks, to do the things we all know deep in our hearts need to be done to get our states and our cities, and most importantly, our country back on the right track. And that's why I'm committed not just to talk about Wisconsin, but to talk about this all around the country, to make sure that we do not just what we need to do to win in November, but more importantly, we do what needs to be done to get this country back on track come January and beyond. So with that, I'll take some questions if you got them. Okay, good.
So, Governor, if I'm going to distill down your speech in totality, the point is that we should pack up our things and move to Illinois.
Yeah.
In all seriousness, before we get to questions, I'll take the moderator's prerogative. I was joking.
See, insert the sarcasm, right?
The state-by-state comparisons, though, how helpful are those, or were they for you and perhaps for other governors? You were able to look to the example of Illinois and then the positive example of Indiana as well. Did that factor in at all?
Yeah, we talked about it. I mean, in our case, we had our opponent was the mayor of Milwaukee, where there were some direct comparisons between the state and the city of Milwaukee as well. But there's no doubt about it. If you look, not just at Illinois, but other states, we were talking about this earlier, Chief Executive Magazine is a good example. Historically, in my state, Wisconsin was historically in the bottom 10. The year before I took office, we were 41. Year before that, 43. Last year, we moved from 41 up 17 spots to number 24. And this year, we moved up to number 20. Now, I love competition. I know a lot of other governors, particularly a lot of Republican governors, love that competition. Now, for Chief Executive Magazine, I was a guest host this morning on Squawk Box and CNBC. If you tweet, hashtag best states WI if you want to vote for Wisconsin. But they have rankings, others have rankings. But for us, it's actually very helpful because it allows us to pinpoint and hone in on things that make us more competitive, not only states to live in, to work in, to play in, but also states to do business on. That is incredibly helpful. We mentioned those rankings, not just business rankings, but I mentioned, the pension, the Pew Center study, and some other things like that point out all those different rankings help us out incredibly so.
So now we'll go to questions. If you could just state your name and affiliation, and remember, a question ends in a question mark. We could start up here. And there's a mic which will come around, so just wait for that.
Thank you. I'm J.P. Donlin with Chief Executive Magazine, the author of these rankings. Governor, considering that Stockton, California just declared bankruptcy Thursday last, and the city councilor members of San Jose intimated that maybe that's close for them, what advice would you give Governor Brown at this stage?
I'd give perspective. When I was last at the commercial club in Chicago, I was careful to say that I wasn't poaching jobs when I was speaking in Chicago, and I just was encouraging global companies looking to expand to Wisconsin. I'm careful that every jurisdiction is a little bit different. So I'm not going to presuppose that I can give advice on exactly what to do, whether it's New York or California or Illinois or Chicago or anywhere else. But I would give perspective, and that is, they're literally at the edge of a precipice in California. And it's one of those times where, California is obviously a very important state, not just from a perception standpoint, but in terms of this nation's economy. And I think for a lot of us, even far removed from that coast, just like I know in my case, in my region, I literally, as much as I love to bring jobs up from Illinois, I know I need a healthy Chicago and a healthy Illinois because I compete globally, not just one state versus another. So as much as I have a little bit of fun with that, I still want them. And part of the reason why I came down and spoke to the commercial club in Chicago was I literally wanted to inspire them to inspire their leaders in Springfield to make some changes. And I would say the same thing in Sacramento. That as a nation, for California, as big a part of it is the nation's economy, there's got to be some changes. One of the things I point out before, and I want to be clear, I love public employees. My problem has been I love public servants. My problem has been with public employee unions. Big government union bosses have been a major problem, not just for elected officials, but frankly, they've been a big problem for a lot of good, hardworking, dedicated public servants. When you think of teachers and county workers and city workers and others out there, one of the biggest disadvantages for some of our best public servants has been the fact that the unions have forced them to be treated the same way as those who are mediocre or poor performers. And for us, one of the greatest things we did was we freed them from that. Like I said, we have no, anybody except for the handful that are in contracts can now hire based on merit. They can pay based on performance. Those are incredible advantages. You get back to the heart of your point with Jerry Brown, though, they've got to take that pension on. And again, it's one of those where not only looking out for the taxpayers, not only looking out for the economy, but the other thing is looking out for the public employees themselves. In my state, the irony is for all the hype, for all the protest, my pension system's 100% funded. My public employees who will eventually be retirees are some of the safest in the world because not just I, but others before me made prudent, fiscally conservative decisions that put us in a better place to protect their assets. One final thing just on that, aside from that, I remember last year probably was late in March, so it was at the height of all the protests. I was doing interviews. Most of my interviews I would do with Wisconsin media outlets, but that particular day I was doing with an international media outlet. You can guess it does a lot with different investors around the globe. And the guy came in and he asked a very prudent question. He said, he was walking in, you could hear all the protesters. He's walking through, 90, 100,000 people around the Capitol. You could hear, it was like, have you ever been or seen a European soccer match and you hear all the horns and all that going on? It sounded like that, right? And he came in and he said, my readers are investors, and investors don't like uncertainty. So what can you tell my investors about, or my readers about investing in your state that'll make them call? Because right now, it seems kind of uncertain. And I said, what you see around the Capitol was temporary political unrest. What we're doing is long-term financial stability. So because of that, that will make us one of the best places in the world to invest in because, and little did I know how bad things we get not only in California and Illinois, but in Greece and elsewhere, it just compounded my point that by getting our fiscal house in order, it wasn't just good for our finances, it was good for our economy. Because people want to invest in places, cities, jurisdictions, and states that have their act together.
All right, we have one over here.
Governor, I'm Ken Langone. Nice meeting you.
Good to see you.
We've talked on the phone a couple of times.
Yeah, good to see you.
Congratulations on your victory.
Thank you.
I happen to think your victory, that election, is probably as important an election as we're going to have in this country in a long time, including the one coming up in November. That said, you've now gone to a much higher level of standing, both in the nation and in the party. And I guess what I'm asking you is to think about taking advantage of that platform. And let me be very blunt. From 2001 to 2007, we, the Republican Party, did a hell of a good job of spending money in Washington, okay? And I think that the days are over when we can cast ourselves one way and do something else. And I'm appealing to you with this new platform you've got, and I don't know if you realize it, the awesome respect you have from so many Americans across the United States. And by the way, I'm one for giving up names. I asked Congressman Ryan, who's now a deficit hawk, where was he in those 6 years when we were spending money like drunk sailors in Washington? He voted for every spending bill that came down the road. I'm suspicious of people that have a newfound faith. We all have come to Jesus moments, but this is one that I think. And the second thing, for example, is noticeably absent from the health care bill is anything to do with tort reform. So I think, for example, and I'm very involved in a medical center here in New York, which thank God is doing very well, but we suffer the same problems with spurious lawsuits and defensive medicine. And I think it's very important that we address those people in our party who are taking money left and right from the same trial lawyers that we say are the problem. For example, Lindsey Graham in South Carolina. I think, frankly, you've got a great opportunity to be very forceful and very candid and hold a lot of people in our party accountable. And I think if we do that, we're going to be much stronger and have a much bigger base than we now have. So I'm just curious how you react to that newfound authority that I hope you know you have.
Well, I'll start in reverse order. On the lawsuit reform, it's interesting, of all the different things, and I think it may have been mentioned on the Chief Executive magazine, or if it wasn't mentioned in reference, it was some of the number of chief executives mentioned in our rankings going up. That was one of the factors. In our first month to 5 weeks, I call it a special session, one of the biggest things we did was I packaged together 8 years worth of major tort reform that had been vetoed by my predecessor, put it in the one package, and we passed it right away off the bat. Because we knew lowering the tax burden, streamlining the regulatory process, so what we enforced was about common sense, not about bureaucratic red tape, and stopping frivolous and out-of-control lawsuits, whether it was for major investors, whether it was small businesses. Heck, in my state, family farmers. Family farmers get killed by frivolous nuisance lawsuits as well. We knew it when it came to healthcare and other options out there. That was tremendously, tremendously important. So that, without a doubt, I think you're right. At both the states and at the national level, that's something we can do more with. And I think it ties directly into jobs. One other part on the healthcare, this is something I think you're going to see more governors talking about, not just Republicans, but sadly, I think you're going to see more Democrats talking about it after the election, because governors understand we can't print money. And Medicaid already eats up, it's the fastest growing part of nearly every budget in America. In our state, education is the biggest portion of our budget, but Medicaid is by far the fastest growing portion of our budget, and it'll soon surpass education if we don't get it under control. Tort reform control is a part of it, but the other part is it's why the President's so-called Affordable Care Act is such a mess on many levels, but not the least of which is at the states. And it's why a handful of us have already, we haven't announced it yet, but we've already raised concerns about not only participating in exchanges, but being involved in the Medicaid expansion. That's one of the few things in the court's decision that gave us any real leverage, because the federal government they don't have the money for it. And what they're doing is they're just dumping it onto the states. And just to put this in perspective, Medicaid is already growing at unsustainable levels, states all across America, just on its own. The CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, already points out, according to their numbers for Obamacare right now, on top of that unsustainable growth, they're projecting a 2.8% increase just in the expanded Medicaid component under Obamacare in the first 8 years alone, from 2014 on in Obamacare. Where's that money going to come from? It's not going to come from the federal government. It's going to come from state taxpayers. So anybody who doesn't think that state income taxes, state sales tax, other taxes aren't going to go up to pay for Obamacare just isn't looking at where budgets are across the country. So not only is it a massive federal tax increase, it is a massive state tax increase in every state across America that chooses to participate in that. That's something we should talk about from every hilltop between now and the November 6th election. And you're right, and the other part on spending, there's no doubt about it. We've got to rein in spending, and we're going to keep talking about it. We're going to hold people accountable about it. The one thing I said that I hope even more than what it means for November 6th, I hope between November 6th and January 20th, if there's a new president and there's a new Congress, that they'll talk about is how to act swiftly to take the bold actions they talked about during the campaign and implement them early on. Because right after the elections in November of 2010, I went and met in public with all the Republicans, both those in office and the new ones in both of my chambers. The headline the next day was, Walker says, put up or shut up. And the reason I said that was, said the voters sent a clear message. In my state, before 2010, everything was Democrat. The governor, both houses, the majority of seats in the House, both U.S. senators. On November 2nd, 2010, we elected a new governor, new lieutenant governor, new U.S. senator, new majorities in the House, new majorities in both houses of the legislature, all Republican. I said to that crowd at that day, I said, if we're just a little bit less bad than they are, they're going to kick us out and put those guys back again because they know how to be bad better than we do. But I said, if instead we do what we said, and we're not afraid to stand up and do what we told the voters we were going to do. I said, little did I know it would happen sooner than I thought, but I said they'll reward us. They'll keep us in office. They'll want us to continue down that path. So I think the key is holding our candidates accountable between now and November 6th to campaign boldly, but then more importantly, after November 6th, hold them even more accountable to act boldly, not just for those of us who are true believers, but because in the end, the reason we believe, not just because it's good for the cause or good for the party, it's good for America.
Right up here. Just wait for the mic if you don't mind.
Mark Skousen, editor of Forecasts and Strategies. You mentioned your kids. I have a daughter, Leslie, who's a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, a big Badger fan. But of course, she's been heavily influenced by her other professors there and the protesters. So she's on that side. I have 5 kids, and she's the only one who's a social democrat. So what would you tell her after this recall? Is there all this bitterness, and is it so divisive now, or what are you telling the opposition, the protesters? What would you say to my daughter to say, hey, we can turn this thing around and get her on your side?
Yeah, there's 2 different parts on the both on the substance and just on the atmosphere, because I think your daughter, probably in talking to you about this, picked up a little bit of both the policy differences she may have with me and others, and just the atmosphere of. The interesting thing is, after the election, the atmosphere is eased tremendously. Now, it wasn't just because some of you may have heard about this famous brat and beer fest I had. But we actually had beer, and we actually had good Wisconsin brats. But we had I invited, it was my wife's idea, so I'll give credit where credit's due. She said the weekend before the election, she said, Scott, you need to do something on election night to bring people together. She said, why don't you have them over for breakfast or lunch? The only tweak I can claim to make it a little bit better, her great idea was, I said, well, it's June in Wisconsin. We've got a big, governor's residence that overlooks one of the best views in the country of a governor's residence, Lake Mendota, where you can see the University of Wisconsin, the capital, across the way. I said, let's have everybody over for brats and burgers, and we'll get some beer. And who can not have a good time on a good, nice, Wisconsin June evening? And so we did. We had almost 400 lawmakers, spouses, and we invited staff. And why the staff was so important is I was for 8 years in the legislature. One of the things I mentioned, about not personalizing your differences, was one of the other big important things was not only for lawmakers but for their staff to be able to, to disagree on things, because we had plenty of passionate debates before all this. It's not like it's the first time it's ever happened. But then you could go out, you could have a beer, or you could have a burger or brat somewhere, and you can enjoy it. What happened in Wisconsin, which gets to the atmosphere issue, is we had about 10 days in, when the state senators figured out how to leave the state of Wisconsin, how that could stop things, that weird provision that we had that nobody had ever used before. When they figured out how to do that, that's when all the national folks came in. That's when Trump and everybody came in. When you saw the numbers go from 10, 15,000 up to 80, 90, 100,000, and things changed. And that's not just, that's not hype on my part. You could see the Teamsters trucks in. You could see the signs that said, ask me from New Jersey, or heck, I'll tell you a funny story just as an aside. I was here last year after this all happened, and I was going to a meeting, and I got out of the truck. I was not too far, a couple blocks from here. Got out of the truck, I'm in a black trooper's vehicle from New York, and get out, and some guy across the street halfway down the block yells, "Hey, Governor Walker." So being from the Midwest, I turned and went, "Hi," right? He goes, "You suck." He said, I followed you all the way to Madison. I protested you. You're scum of the earth. I hate you. And the poor guy I was with was all panicked, kind of like, think he's not a very good host. There's Joe right there, the guy I was with. And Joe's kind of panicked, and I said, see, they weren't all from Wisconsin. So to make my point on that, I think the easing happened. The election was over. I even had some of the Capitol Police tell me that literally the day after the election, that a bunch of the most well-known protesters were gone. They said because they moved on because they weren't being paid to be in Wisconsin anymore. They flat told me that. The Capitol Police did from when their intel. So I think what happened is they probably moved to Florida or Ohio or other states like that for the presidential election. But I think you've already seen a little bit of easing on that. The other easing you see is our legislature's not in session until next January. So it's plenty of time for us to work on issues. And I think in the end, the other big thing is there are plenty of issues that can have economic value to our state that are jobs related that aren't particularly partisan, that things that we can work on, some workforce development issues, some things like that, where we have, as many states do, we have some huge shortages, welders, machinists, fabricators, others, advanced manufacturing positions, and there are things we're trying to do to create a greater pipeline of people into those jobs that aren't particularly partisan that we can act on.
Sir, right up here.
Harvey Yashovsky from 1877spirits.com. Congratulations. Firstly, you've become a real hero to all those believers in conservative thought here in America. I'd like to ask you about your plans for the fall in terms of bringing this message that's so sorely needed to be heard around the rest of the country, both of your success in implementing it, and simply put, you have an excellent ability to articulate these ideas in sensible, brief, straightforward sentences. So what are your plans? I don't mean plans in running for office.
Thank you.
Well, you know,
my wife's not here, but I could feel a shoe coming through the window at me if I talked about anything other than being governor, right?
So what are your plans for involvement in the fall campaign?
Well, let me take a step back for a second, because somebody a couple weeks ago asked me a similar question. A Washington-based media outlet said, what are you going to do with this notoriety? And I said, there's really three things. One, this is part of what I did with my trip to Chicago recently. I'm going to advocate in-state and out-state, around the globe, anywhere I can, to bring more employers into my state to put more people to work. I'm going to go out and use that attention. I'm going to use the fact that people now, not that they necessarily wouldn't have taken calls before, but they'll definitely take calls now to make the case about growing and expanding in the state of Wisconsin, because I think that's the number one thing I was elected to do. It's the number one thing I can do, and it's something where I'm not making government do it, but I can use my role to say, look at the good things we've done, look at the barriers we've removed, because it's not government that creates jobs, it's people that create jobs, but look how much easier we've made it for people to create jobs in the state of Wisconsin. So that's the number one thing I do. But secondly, which goes to your point, is I said I'm going to go out and aggressively campaign for like-minded candidates. And that means, certainly in Wisconsin, just in of itself, we're a swing state. We're a state where Governor Romney went from being double digits down 6 months before my election to 2 weeks later in the Rasmussen poll, he was up by 3 points. Now, it's like a roller coaster. It'll go up and down. But I think there are a significant number of voters in my state, not just Republicans and conservatives, but independent swing voters who now will consider, not guaranteed, will consider voting for Governor Romney. My advice to him, as well as advice on other things, but on this particular point, was come back to Wisconsin often. But remember, when you come, if you want to have a chance with those swing voters that will determine who wins Wisconsin and maybe be, in turn, who wins in America, campaign as though the R next to your name is not just for Republican like me. Campaign as though the R next to your name stands for reformer just like me. If you talk about taking on bold reforms to help get the government out of the way of the economy, to help the private sector grow, and to put our fiscal house back in order, you do that, I believe, in my state and in swing states all across America, There are voters hungry for people to stand up and tell the truth, to tell it convincingly and repetitively, and to tell people how they're going to turn things around. I think people are hungry for that, and I think the more often you come in the state to do that, the better off. In our case, in addition to helping Wisconsin, I've told Governor Romney I'd help anywhere else, so they're sending me a number of other places around the country as our schedule permits. But we also have in Wisconsin, we have an open seat in the United States Senate that today is held by a Democrat. We had a 4-way Republican primary that's up mid-August. We're very likely to win that, and obviously I'll be aggressively campaigning for that. We've got 2 swing House seats, although I think we're in pretty good shape, both of which I won convincingly, but they're still tight seats because they're first term, including one guy, Sean Duffy, who but he took the seat that David Obey, the former House Appropriations Chair, had since 1969, before Sean was born. So we'll campaign for that, but I'll campaign for others across the country. But then the third thing, so I'll campaign for like-minded candidates. The third thing, though, is part of why I'm here today as well. Is I said the other part I'd like to use whatever notoriety, attention I have to, business, helping like-minded candidates, but third I think is most important, and that is having an influence on issues. I mean, to me, just the mere fact that you now have other governors and other mayors talking about public policy in regards to pension reform, collective bargaining issues, things of that nature, tenure, seniority. I mean, a lot of governors kid me saying, thanks. You'd be amazed how many other governors did great things in the last year and a half, but most of them did it under the cover that we got with all the attention in Wisconsin. But there's a lot of great changes that were made all across America in the last year and a half. Most of them don't get nearly the amount of attention because they did bits or pieces, but they were all able to do it because we're moving in the right direction. If I can help influence that, if I can influence the health care debate, not just the November elections, but what we as governors do to drive that attention in Washington, what we can do to drive things that, the last thing I just say on this is I think the debate this fall and the debate thereafter should be as simple as it can be. I believe, just like I believed in my state, my opponents, I think you could apply the same thing to the president. I believe my opponents believe the measure of success for them in government is how many more people are dependent on government services, particularly unemployment. It is my belief, and I hope all of you in this room, that our measure of success is just the opposite. How many fewer people are dependent on government? Not because we kick them out on the streets, but because we've done things that empower the private sector to create more opportunities for people to take advantage of so they can control their own destiny. What we should be about is ultimately not just about jobs or a slogan. It should be about more freedom and more prosperity. If you have more freedom and more prosperity, people will ultimately succeed and do well, and it'll help all of us.
We actually, do we have any time left, or we have a few minutes left?
We've got giving speeches in every answer.
I want to read you one from an online viewer.
Okay.
The woman's name is Lauren in Arizona. We're live streaming this on our website, Public Sector Inc. She says, "Governor, congratulations. You took on the fight and won. You are an example for all. What would you suggest to other governors tackling similar issues? What shouldn't they do to make it work?" It's a thoughtful question.
Yeah. Actually, I got asked a similar, of all people, I was on Morning Joe last year, and Mika asked me, in retrospect, what have you learned? And Joe immediately said, you don't have to answer this as a setup. I said, no. I said, I like that question. And this would be my answer to this online viewer as well. I think if I had it to do over again, I would have spent more time last January and February laying the groundwork for what we were doing. I think if anything, my mistake, probably like a lot of people who have got a business owner mindset, particularly small business, was I just came in to fix it. Now, that's great, but I think the problem was I spent my time fixing it first and then talked about it. The reason I did that was simple. Most politicians talk about it and never fix it, right? What I learned is you need to do both. I said, I'm not ever going to let the process get in the way of the final product. I'm still going to produce. I still need to fix things. But what I learned, and what not just the public, but my wife in particular, I think advised me on this, is you need to have people have a better understanding of what's happening and why up front. So I'll give you an example. If I'd spent all last January, in addition to talking about our special session on jobs, If I'd gone around my state and said, do you know that most schools, almost every school in our state, has to buy their health insurance from just one company, and that's costing them tens of millions of dollars, I think most voters would have said, fix it, right? If I had said, do you know under collective bargaining, there's a bus driver in the city of Madison where our state's capital is who made more than $150,000 a year because of overtime abuse under collective bargaining, most voters would have said, you got to fix that. Do you know in some of our state agencies that because of collective bargaining in the past, people could literally call in sick on their shift and come back and work the next shift and get time and a half? I said, most voters, if I told them that, would have said, fix it. My problem was I was so eager to fix it, I didn't talk about it. So I think the lesson for not just other governors, but I'd say for other mayors, because I think mayors face a lot of these same challenges as well, is talk about it, but don't use talking about it as an excuse to fix it. Do the two together. If you talk about it, if you're honest with people, I believe people can handle the truth. If you talk about what's really before us and what our options are, I think people can handle it, but don't use it as an excuse to drag it on indefinitely, then act on it.
Thank you very much, Governor.
I think it is clear how fortunate we are to believe in the power of ideas.
Supply the common sense and the fresh thinking of the Manhattan Institute.